Hello and welcome. Enrico E. Manalo here with nonprofit consultant and executive and career coach Yejin Lee. Hey Yejin, given your work, what's your biggest frustration when it comes to organizational change efforts?
Just diving right in. Hi, everyone. Very happy to be here. I would say that there are probably two main things that I find
Okay.
challenging or frustrating. And one of them is just the wide gap between what people think they're doing and what they're actually doing, and the inability to sort of identify how to bridge those things. So that's one. And then I think the second piece is around the lack of investment in accountability processes. And I mean that sort of outside of HR or outside of reporting like compliance things, but genuine processes of like individual and collective accountability towards things that an organization might espouse. They value like equity and justice.
Nice. Yeah, those are huge barriers. So before we dive more deeply into that, I just want to kind of help our audience to become familiar with who you are. So, could you tell us a little bit about how you arrived at your purpose, at your passion and purpose, rather?
Yeah, absolutely. I love talking about arrival. I think that that's a really nice way of framing. So I am someone who, I studied in college a lot of like critical race theory, history, and immigration, and things like that, and sort of decided that I would be committed to a life of racial equity. I started working as a community organizer for a New York City nonprofit and was surrounded by amazing humans doing a lot of amazing anti-violence work, and also was exposed for the first time to like real fluency in sort of social justice and racial justice, and that felt really amazing. But I started seeing some gaps between like what organizations were saying sort of in the outside world and what was happening within the actual institutions. Then moved on to working in fundraising, and fundraising and nonprofit is very hard. It's also where, because you're sort of closer to the money, where you see a lot more concessions around values. And so what I liked about fundraising was that I had, as a busybody, I had access to lots of stuff, right? Like you have to know programming back and forth. But I also had more access and exposure to things related to like governance. So how are
Mm,
decision-making processes at the board level influencing what became possible in programming,
right.
and sort of all the while being part of like racial justice committees or diversity, equity, and inclusion committees, and also seeing the relationship between like an organization's orientation around funding and what was possible or impossible as far as operationalizing equity. So I was doing fundraising for a while, sort of met my expiration date sooner than I thought.
And this
Um,
was just around the time that we met, correct?
it was maybe a year and a half before. So I was
Okay.
actually able to transition then into sort of like systems and process design with
Oh, I
equity sort
see.
of at the center.
Mhm.
So, even something as boring as like, how do you create a CRM, like a client relations management system that is centering the people who use it the most, which are
Mm,
often like, you know, darker skinned people of color and entry level roles. And so just thinking about what are design processes that really center equity. And so after that, it was when I sort of launched into my own thing. And I do share
wow.
that I was laid off from my last job, which was like extremely painful and hard.
Yeah.
And, I saw it as an opportunity to like try my own thing. And so what I say about what I'm doing now is that I'm not new to the work. I'm just doing it in a new way.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I spend my time now sort of as a coach. I offer individual coaching mostly for people of color, whether it's to sort of figure out how to strategically survive oppressive experiences in institutions, or to like find new routes for passion and purpose. I think that, it's important to find economic work is economic work, and sometimes that can coincide with passion and purpose, and sometimes it doesn't have to.
Yeah.
So yeah, supporting people of color and like liberating themselves from the tethers of white supremacy. I also do some leadership coaching, so helping leaders sort of identify that gap that I was talking about before, like what you think you're doing, what you're actually doing, and like what is the actual work of bridging that. And then some org consulting. I sort of specialize in racial equity audits.
So you kinda I feel like you kinda downplayed it a little bit. You kinda said, "Oh, well, now I'm just kinda doing my own thing." If you don't follow Yejin on social media, I suggest that you do that right now, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah, the reception for your work really seems to be very strong, and so it seems like doing your own thing is really working for you.
Yeah, it's sort of wild because even just a year and a half ago, I don't think I ever would have imagined going off on my own. I think I really believed like I am someone who will always be in the nonprofit world. I'll always be within an institution. I never want to lead my own things. And I think some of that is like, you know, perhaps expressions of like imposter syndrome or like who should be leading this work. And
Right.
so internalized expressions of that. And I think some of it was just like, I just didn't know anything else. I went right out of college into the nonprofit world and just stayed there for 12 to 13 years and couldn't even imagine a different iteration or expression of caring and
Yeah.
caring about particular things. So it is, thank you for bringing me back to the greatness of the last year. And yeah, I think a lot of it was just limited by what I thought was possible.
Well, it's so interesting to hear you say that because like I experience you as somebody who is deeply educated in the work, who is got a real energy around the work. And so I think it's such a stark reminder that what you're describing is what we might frame as learned helplessness. And this can happen to anybody, right? So when you're in a system that grinds you down, that doesn't respect you, that undermines you, that makes you question your own competence, your skills, everything about you, well, there's a certain amount of learned helplessness that can creep in. Right. And this is often that internal voice that gets in the way of us taking risks and putting ourselves out there. And this sounds like, and in another era, it might have been dismissed as touchy feely kind of stuff. But we know that the touchy feely kind of stuff is very literally at the heart of all the human stuff that we do. So it's definitely worth paying attention to. And it's really inspiring to see you kind of stride out on your own and to have that wonderful reception. And, I'm just so glad that we're here finally talking to kind of address some of the stuff that Yejin and I have gone through today. There was an unexpected power outage, which is why we are streaming now, and the fire alarms and sprinkler systems were just being tested in my building, so I actually had to miss another meeting for this. And wow, yeah. It's been a lot, but we're really glad to be here. And I think now I want to kind of pivot to we were talking about the gap, right? That you're so interested in this gap between what people think they're doing or what they say they're doing and what's actually happening. And part of that you and I have identified in our conversations, which have been ongoing for about a year or so, is this idea of complacency. So I wonder if we can kind of talk about that a little bit. So, for example, how are we seeing complacency in the dominant culture when it comes to racial equity?
Yeah, thank you for that invitation. I think that um, there's so many people doing this work. And I think that one thing that I like to say is, my particular focus, my particular audience, it's not to say that that's like the only thing that one should care about, but I say that because I focus a lot on complacency, specifically of individuals and institutions that are very fluent in
Hmm.
social justice speak.
Okay.
So, there's a difference between that, obviously, and an organization that is, actively saying terrible things about particular communities. Like that work is very important. That is not work that I focus on. I focus more on organizations that might have a really dope BLM statement of solidarity, but like their practices internally look very, very different from what they're
Mm,
espousing in their language. And so I think for me, my focus on complacency is largely around people who think they're done the work. I think that, I mean, complacency in general is just really about like, I don't want to move anymore, right? Like I'm good. I'm good where I am. And I think the dangers of that, I started seeing as people were talking more about anti-racism versus like DEI, people starting to use that language more and being like, I'm an anti-racist. And I'm like, how? Literally, how are you an
without
anti-racist?
saying the words.
Yeah. And so, a lot of my focus is just on like, okay, And maybe my style isn't for everyone. I am very direct in my approach. And I think that, I am offered some privileges based on my identities and based on my experiences that enable me to access that in ways that other folks might not be able to. But that's just sort of my approach and style. But a lot of my work is about humbling people.
Mm.
It's about being like, you think you know. What makes you think you know? There have been instances where people would say, like, oh, that wasn't racist. And I will say, especially if they're a white person, I'll say, and what gives you the authority and experience and confidence to determine what is and is not racism? I will like wait to hear your operating definitions. And people
Are,
don't always like that.
are you still waiting?
I am still waiting. So I think that, confronting this gap requires a level of humility that I think a lot of people don't exercise. And I do think some of it is about this fear of being called out or called in as racist. And I think that, people fear that more than fearing the actual harm they cause as a result of their
Yeah.
racism. And so, a lot of my work is focused on that, both at an organizational level, but also at an individual one, because as you know, like those things can transform without one another.
Mm.
But yeah, just like broadly speaking, I'm happy to talk more specifics, but yeah, I would say that that's sort of the focus on my work. And I think the complacency comes from not being able to take critical feedback, being like, there's no way that I'm racist. Look at everything we've offered you. I think forced gratitude is a practice institutionally, like, oh, we actually increased everyone's salary by 2%. And so you should be grateful and never speak up about X, Y, or Z. And so I think that, there are many different manifestations of complacency, particularly in organizations that are very good at language.
Hmm.
But I think that the lack of accountability structures, the lack of humility, and the lack of growth orientation, just this idea like, I've put in my dues. I'm done. I read this book. I
Right.
read The New Jim Crow. I'm part of a book club.
Hmm.
Like that's great. I would never stop anyone from like increasing their attunement and knowledge, but like until it's translated into praxis, until it is translated into millions of little shifts,
Yeah.
like to me, that's not the work.
I mean, as you were talking, I was reflecting on interactions that I've had with people who could be framed as being complacent in the work. Before the pandemic, I was in a bar with a friend and we were talking, it was around the primaries. So we were talking about the candidates that we were supporting. And there was a woman who was at the bar next to us who overheard the conversation and didn't particularly care for the candidate that I was supporting. And so she came over and said, I'll be supporting Joe Biden like the majority of black women in South Carolina. And her sister ran over and said, she's actually pretty smart. Now, it's my experience that if somebody has to tell another that somebody's actually pretty smart, they actually may not be, but, my sample size could be low. Nonetheless, it was the confidence in that statement. I recognize that we were in a bar. She may not have been in her best mind or her best self. But nonetheless, the confidence that she was doing the right thing and I was therefore doing the wrong thing, that just kind of shut down any further conversation. And when that happens, I mean, to me, that seems very much like a form of complacency. What are your thoughts?
Oh, 100%. I mean, if anyone knows me or has followed me, I am very obsessed with this psychological study called the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Oh my God,
Um,
me too.
right? So I'm just going to like briefly explain, but essentially, well, also it's hilarious to talk about how it came about. So basically, there was this person, how if you use, you could use like lemon juice as invisible ink. So this person thought that meant if you put lemon juice in your face, a security camera will not capture your face. So this
Yeah.
person attempted to rob a bank and like was wildly unsuccessful. And so these psychologists were like, what gave this person the confidence like to think that they could pull off a heist of this magnitude? And so there was a psychological study done, and essentially the results are like people who are incompetent at something, and I'm not saying that, and they're not saying that to be mean, just descriptive, right? If someone's
Not a
incompetent
value
at
judgment,
something,
right?
right, just like an assessment.
Yeah.
So if there's low competence, that person is more likely to see themselves as competent because simply they don't have the ability to assess competence. And then
Yes.
on the other side of that scale, people who do have competence are more likely to put themselves lower than they should be. And they also think that things that are easy for them are easy for other people. So I bring this up a lot in the context of complacency, particularly around issues of equity and justice, because I think there are a lot of people who think they know what this work is because they don't actually know what this work is. And so a lot of the leaders that, I've confronted, or, if I'm supporting individuals in like advocating for themselves safely in the context of experiencing racism in the workplace, really thinking about like, how does this particular barrier get in the way of safe self-advocacy or of organizational transformation? So I think definitely it's a form of, I also use this term, it might be wildly incorrect, but I talk about like self-gaslighting. So it's
Okay.
not like I'm actively trying to, change your reality and make you think that there's something else happening. It's like, if I don't know what reality is because I lack attunement and because I think I'm really good at the thing, but I'm not, then my reality is very much informed by my ineptitude. And so I'm not seeing what other people are seeing. So I
Right.
think that that's a level of, again, ineptitude sounds like a mean word, and I just mean it descriptively. But if you're like inept at something and you don't think you're inept at it, and then you're like leading work around that, and you're like
Yeah.
denying other people's experiences, and you feel very good about where you are, to me, it suggests that one, you are not humble. Two, you don't have growth orientation. And three, there's possibility that like you lack emotional resilience to receive critical feedback.
Yeah, and I used to work with children as an English as a foreign language teacher, and sometimes I would have them practicing together, and you would often see one of the children kind of out of all of the kids kind of reacting poorly to a correction that they received from a peer. It usually looks something like this: "No, I know how to do it," right? And the weirdest thing is we spend a lot of time developing ourselves into adults through school, through experience, through jobs, what have you. And yet there's so many dynamics common to us as children that persist with us our entire lives, right? And it's seen as insulting to refer to somebody as childish, derogatory to refer to somebody as childlike. However, we all were once children, so what's the problem here? And I will also say that it's children that play, that adapt, and that grow. And so why would we want to move out of that, right? If we stop growing, well, what's the most extreme form of stopping growing is like cell death, right? That's
Mm.
literal death for us. We also know that when people stop working, when their minds are not engaged, sometimes people who retire, they die within a few years. What I'm getting at here is growth is deeply, deeply important to the human experience and certainly its quality. So we've talked a lot about complacence and maybe some examples that can help people along. For example, I mentioned that Joe Biden story, but I've had people tell me to my face that they could not be racist because they voted for Obama or they marched in the 60s. And it's like, if you marched in the 60s, that's a lot of complacency, sir or ma'am.
Yeah, it is wild when people will dig like, I was going to say centuries because I'm very bad at math. Decades. Decades is the right word.
Wow,
Uh,
we are really breaking stereotypes. I actually have
totally.
fails math
Bad
next
mather
to yeah,
over
bad
here.
mathing Asians here.
Yes, decades. It is, if you like have to source decades ago to prove that, you're not racist, yeah, that's like, probably not a great sign. But yeah, I think that I think defensiveness is a huge piece of this. So, I think like a moment of conflict, say someone is being asked to account for something they've said or something they've tolerated, or, not actually calling in one of their own peers, whatever it may be, there's this moment of conflict, right? And I think for me, complacency is exercised in response to conflict.
Mm,
Um, and it's, I think it also can be a passive experience, right? It can just be like, well, I've read a bunch of books, so I feel like I'm done. Or, people are talking about also like allyship fatigue, which, functionally I can kind of understand the point of talking about it. And then I'm also like, and what about the fatigue of people of like marginalized identities and like being murdered all the time? Like, what about that?
It's a
But
little
yeah, I
tiring.
think that, what's that?
I said it's a little tiring.
I mean, I do think that there is something about like if your sense of urgency and your pace and like wanting to be an aspiring co-conspirator for Black lives or for racial equity or for, um, any of these things, if your pace is getting in the way of like lifelong commitment, then that is something that like is a barrier. But in general, I'm like, yeah, I think that maybe you also just need to like increase your endurance. You have to increase your resilience, increase your endurance, and like focus on those things. But yeah, I think that a lot of times in these moments of conflict, I'm really interested in how people respond, right? Like, I think
Yeah.
that, I learn a lot about where people are in their journeys. And not just, I think that as someone who has like previously intellectualized things as a way of not actually processing feelings, I totally get that that could be really important. And again, would never detract anyone from doing like learning. But I can tell in moments of conflict how people respond to it, whether they've done any of the work of translating it into action. And so if
Mm,
someone is really good at saying a certain thing, or even is like, I don't know, fluent in talking about transformative justice, but
yeah.
then when they are asked to account for harm they cause, they
Hmm.
suddenly thrash about, or they say like, this is cancel culture just as a way of skirting
Right.
accountability, then I'm like, oh, okay, I now see the gap. I now see what your journey has been and what you haven't focused on.
I think it's worth mentioning at this point that complacency can happen at any level, right? So if you are somebody whose whole career has been racial equity, diversity, equity, inclusion, racial and social justice, I've actually met people who are deeply, deeply, deeply sophisticated in this work, and perhaps at one point were considered thought leaders. However, when confronted with their own stuff, sometimes what happens is because they are so sophisticated, they are extra sophisticated at getting out of the accountability thing. I'm not sure if that's something that you've encountered, but it strikes me that, and I hope I'm not overstating the case here, but that seems like it could be dangerous ultimately.
Yeah, I think about my dad is certainly not someone who's been doing this work for a really long time, but I'm bringing this up because he used to say, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Like he would say that all the
Right.
time in my youth. And actually, he has transformed so much. And so I just think about like, what do we lose by choosing to stop growing? And
Mm,
I also say this as someone who like has only experienced 34 years of life. Like I know that there's like fatigue that comes with living. So I want to acknowledge that like a piece of this work being like racial justice or just justice work in general, is like genuinely healing and self-care. So I think there's that piece. But what becomes impossible if we decide that we're done and that we don't want to learn anymore, we don't want to grow anymore. And I do think some of it has to do with fatigue. And I think some of it has to do with pride. This idea that, if it's identified that we caused harm in some way, it means we're disposable. And so I also don't
mm,
believe in disposability politics. Ultimately, I think that, consequences are really important for people to experience,
yeah.
but true accountability, I think, happens in community and is a process, not a transaction, not a one off thing.
Right.
And so I think that, some of it is about a culture, right? So this idea that if someone is called racist, they believe that they will be disposed of forever. Or if someone who's been doing racial equity work is called out for being a transphobe, like, rather than identify, wow, it's possible that I have internalized things related to the cishet patriarchy that are harmful. Let me think about how to excavate that, because they believe maybe that they will be disposed of and that everything. And so
Yeah.
I think that, it's a lot of things interwoven, and some of it is cultural, and then some of it is like related to individual pride.
Yeah. And I think that's we've talked about humility a little bit here, but I think it's also worth highlighting here that this is why community is really important. if I don't have people around me that can kind of check me and be like, yo, Rico, that's pretty messed up. You got to like go back to the drawing board and think about that for a second as my friend, then how am I going to continue going through life? It's so easy. We know that a lot of people who enact interpersonal racism, and this is not to let them off the hook, but they haven't had opportunities to develop. They haven't maybe had somebody in their life who can help them to be accountable. Because if we're really sitting down and thinking about it, who in your life sat you down and said, this is the concept of accountability? This is how it manifests. This is how we can healthily engage in it. And, there's so many things in our lives like this. I had to go to conflict resolution school to learn how to do that. Right. And yeah, I promise you, it's a real field. I have a real degree in it. And it still kind of blows people's minds that somebody would take years out of their life and pay their own money to get this done. But even as a teacher, it really struck me that nobody sits down and teaches children how to learn. We expect that they
Mm,
will do that, right? So this humility piece, a lot of it gets at checking our own assumptions. And once you start down that route, you will find that there are a lot of assumptions and that there is no way for us to stop making assumptions, which is why we have to keep checking in.
yeah, absolutely. I think that there's this piece too around if we all truly genuinely internalize this belief that like we are born into a world that is racist, we're born into a world that is sexist, we're born into a world that is transphobe, like all of these things, um, then how could we not acknowledge that we have internalized a bunch of stuff that we don't yet know how to identify? And so I think that this thing of humility is also just foundationally about this acknowledgement that like we're born into a world that has indoctrinated us to believe in certain kinds of hierarchies. And so the undoing of that, the unlearning of it, unlearning is now a word that people use. And I'm like, are you actually unlearning or are you just using the word? But like the work of unlearning and undoing is like being open to feedback that
Hmm.
like, oh, it is possible that I've never thought about this. So for example, I am new to disability justice
Same.
and thinking about how to account for the many, many years that I never thought about the intersections of disability justice, racial justice, colonialism. And so thinking about how do I account for that? How do I move forward? How do I invite call-ins and call-outs? How do I, it's hard. Like no one wants to be told that they were being messed up. And I'm like, yeah, why would I pretend that I know everything about this? I don't
Yeah.
know anything about this, like
Yeah.
partially because I'm able-bodied, also because we live in a world that like doesn't care. And so I think that this practice of humility inherently has to be growth oriented, right? And like demonstrate an openness to be transformed. And I don't know if that is a piece of the barrier, this like idea that we all require transformation.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's what life is, right? Like we know that your cells replace themselves every couple of years. I'm definitely not the same person I was 34 years ago. Otherwise, I'd be really short and my hair wouldn't look this good, but I digress. Um, so in talking about humility and complacency, what are some of the sort of more surprising places where you've encountered complacency, I guess?
Yeah, I'll say like in activist spaces that do a
Hmm.
lot of like on the ground work. And, this isn't to be like all these spaces are bad, but, I think that as someone who I identify as an angry optimist, I believe I'm an optimist because I like ultimately believe that people and systems can be different. And I'm angry because people aren't doing the things they need to be doing to like transform these things. But as someone who has like experienced chronic hope and then heartbreak every time
Yeah.
I've gone to a job that was like really good at talking about justice, I was surprised every time. And so now I'm like, okay, now I'm going to just expect to be wildly disappointed. And like that will be a better starting point. I'm not suggesting that is the way people should move, but that
Right.
helped me. But yeah, I think that, folks who, weirdly have also just experienced a lot of affirmation. And I'm not saying this to say that we shouldn't be affirmed. Like, I think part of the point of being an active community is to be held accountable and to be affirmed and seen and held and understood. But I think that folks who experience a lot of like wow, look at this leader. Wow, this person's doing amazing work. I don't know if there's something about it becoming harder to
Mm,
exercise humility. And, I also see people struggling with like, I want to feel comfortable in my seat of power, which
mhm.
is for a lot of folks who are conditioned to believe that they should never have power, that they are imposters. Like, I think that's really important work. But sometimes I think people grow in a pendulum so they'll like go from one extreme to another. And
Yeah.
I'm like, we can exist in the middle. So people might be like, I should have no power. I've been, socialized to believe that as a woman of color, X, Y, or Z. And then like go to the other side and be like, I am above reproach.
Yeah.
And it's like, that's not it either. And
Mhm.
maybe that is how some people need to grow. But I do think that it's fine to get there if you're also willing to be held accountable and then move again.
No, I think you're so right, and I use that pendulum image a lot in, when I'm speaking about these kinds of things, right? So people have this idea of balance, right? If you're somebody that subscribes to mindfulness and these kinds of practices, balance and centering, these words are used a lot. However, as somebody who is a language teacher, one of the shortcomings of the English language is that it presents us sometimes with ideas that are static rather than
Mm,
dynamic. So often, inadvertently, we end up with this idea of balance that is not moving, right? It's something that's perfectly still. It's not changing. It exists in a vacuum. And that's not what it is. Balance is more like the pendulum, right? So some days you're really on top of your game, and other days you're really just not. And that's fine because that's part of how the whole thing moves. Now, I do think you're right that without somebody to keep you accountable, and it doesn't necessarily have to be someone, but without something in your life to help you to kind of check yourself, you can end up all over the place. And far from being balanced, you become erratic, right? And when you're in these kinds of erratic patterns, we've all been there, it doesn't feel good. It can feel
mhm.
confusing, can be scary. And often, as the situation gets worse, that's when you thrash around more, you know? And unfortunately, sometimes that makes it even less attractive for somebody to try to come in and to support you because they don't know what's going to splash on them. Now, how do we get out of that? I mean, there are many ways that we could kind of think about that, but I do want to pull on this thread of representation, right?
Mm, mhm.
Because yeah, we as social animals, we look to our leaders, formal or informal, certainly thought leaders. And as we've just been establishing, it's very real possibility that thought leaders are vulnerable to complacency as well. So yeah, what are your thoughts on that in terms of representation?
Oh my gosh. I mean, so many things. I think that representation is important.
Hmm.
I think that it is not everything. Um, I also think that this culture of like iconization and idolization is just generally really unhealthy. Like I'm like, why would we listen more to a celebrity than to like literally our neighbor who like
Yeah,
experiences the impacts of gentrification? Like why would we listen to a celebrity talk about gentrification when we could talk to our neighbor or to like houseless people? Or so I think that, as a society, we are trained to like assign more value to certain perspectives.
yeah,
So I think that that is an inherent limit to representation or any kind of, leadership. I think there are many modes of leadership. So I don't want to say and suggest that all leaders are like this, but I think that they're putting more weight to a singular voice and perspective is inherently going to be limiting. And I think, one of the challenges with assigning one person or few people to represent everything is that the work of inclusivity is also identifying that like we are not a monolith, right? If we're
right.
talking
Yeah,
about the API community, me speaking as an East Asian, Korean American, second generation person whose father was a dentist, so grew up with class privilege, why would I universalize my experience? Like that's going to be so exclusionary and painful. And so I think that it's natural in some ways because it's less messy when you have
yeah.
more singular leaders sort of representing certain ideas or topics. But then I think, especially for those who are less represented, then I think it becomes more important to like protect the perspective over like
Yeah.
what is actually being said and what kind of harm is being caused. So I know that we have specifically talked about the lack of Asian American representation
Oh,
in a
yeah.
lot of things, but in including talks about racial justice. And so, I've seen some like influencers on Instagram who actually have like pretty problematic takes on things like racial triangulation, who are called in by people who have been leading this work for a really long time, and then watching and like just feeling so sad
Yeah.
watching so many people then exercise anti-blackness to defend this person who actually had an anti-black bent on what they were saying. And so I think that I understand the pain. Like there is a pain, I think, that comes from being an Asian American person whose experiences of racial harm have been rendered invisible for a really long time. And then to see someone who is like one of the few representations of, active leadership around a thing being critiqued all
Right.
the time. I can understand that being painful. And then, but I ask these questions of like, what is inherently bad about critique? If it's an
Yeah.
invitation to change and transform and become more inclusive and more radical and deeply embedded in community, like, why would we resist that?
Mhm.
Why?
Well, I've seen time and time again that it's often the critical voices that get tuned out, especially in organizations. Sometimes somebody is raising the alarm about something, or like a whistleblower, for example. And what happens? Well, then that person has to fear retribution from their superiors. Sometimes they might be ostracized or stigmatized. They might not even be able to get a job in their field anymore. And often what happens is, in the whistleblower scenario, hey, thanks very much for bringing our attention to this thing. Now, bye. Right? And it's like,
Right.
what is the messaging there is, don't be a whistleblower, right? We have all these ideas like, don't be a tattletale. That's another one. And yet, I don't want to make a huge deal out of this, but the phenomenon of the Karen is a tattletale kind of whistleblower in a very negative way that seems to be acceptable for whatever reason.
Mm. Yeah, I
Uh,
mean, I would say it's acceptable for all the reasons that it's unacceptable for people of color to be that,
say more.
Well, I think that, if the ultimate goal is to police the power of people of color, then the Karens complaining is in service of that. And like people of color complaining works against that. And I think that whether or not people have an explicit analysis around, like, I doubt that there are executive directors who are like, I want to be a Karen and I want to police the behaviors of people of color. But once again, I think
Right.
it's in some ways the ineptitude or the desire. I think another problem is the desire to remain changeless. I think
Mm,
that complacency can look a bunch of different ways. And so I know there are leaders who like genuinely want to do better, but like just simply don't know how, and aren't, being instructed how, don't have the resources, or like just don't
yeah.
have the ability to like take feedback from their staff. And then there are the people who are like, no, like I simply don't want. So I actually think that, I mean, this is my personal take on like the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I don't really call my work that anymore. I think that, whatever you call it, as long as for me, you're dealing with power, you are
Mhm.
shifting power and how power moves in the organization and how it's accounted for, then, call it whatever. But I think that there are plenty of people in leadership positions who have zero interest in changing how power functions. And so, yeah, I think that's a piece of it too.
Yeah, so absolutely. So my specialty is actually conflict in teams and work groups, and more broadly, organizational conflict. So one of the dynamics that I've seen over and over again is usually that conflict systems in organizations are not well set up. They're usually kind of drop boxes that go to, well, the circular file, or otherwise known as the trash can. The reason being that usually these systems are designed for somebody who is at a lower level, say, to critique or to say something to somebody who is at a higher level. Now, a lot of people in those higher level positions they're not looking for critiques about themselves. They might say they have an open door policy or whatever, but you start talking about something that you don't like about how they did, and well, your job could be at stake. You could, that's where work politics sometimes come into play. And ultimately, what tends to happen is the person that raised the complaint in the first place is asked to leave or else is pressured to go. That's not how you deal with conflict well. I will say that another wrinkle to dealing with conflict in organizations is because there are very real power differentials. If, say, I were to mediate a case, it might be somebody who's in a leadership position and somebody who is not. Now, for mediation to work, you have to be equal within the situation. And I have seen people take that too far, right? So
Mm,
people felt safe in the situation, not recognizing that it's not magic. Once you exit the room, you're back in your old roles. And so I've seen people say to their boss's face or their superior's face something that couldn't be taken back, and frankly, something that was outside of my realm as a mediator to
mm,
help them to address.
yeah.
So these power dynamics are very real, and it makes conflict very difficult to manage at times. Also, because if you're in a powerful position in an institution that is, say, perhaps somewhat bureaucratic, you can slow down the timeline and wait somebody out until the
Yeah.
problem just kind of isn't a problem anymore.
Totally. I talk all the time with my clients or during events, just saying like you can literally use anything to uphold power, systems of oppressive power. Like, and they can look like the exact opposite thing, right? So like, lack of processes or thoughtfully designed processes and systems can lead to people relying on their personal preferences, which can lead to lots of chronic experiences of exclusion and inequity. And on the other hand, you can have like a wealth of processes and systems that are actually maybe intentionally or unintentionally designed to slow things down to make change really difficult. And
Mhm.
so I think, we can use so many things, a sense of urgency versus perfectionism. Like we can use so many things to uphold power. And so a lot of the work that I encourage people to do is to increase attunement. And I sort of want to go back to this thing that you were talking about that, like, you know, where we are in the pendulum can be different. And I also
Mm,
say, what we're feeling at work, I think we need to be like heavily attuned to what we're experiencing, what we're feeling, what is triggering us, what's activating us. Because especially when I'm working with people of color, to surface a bunch of information, data, whether it's like personal data or data about the organization, in order to identify like what is the most strategic and safe way to confront the racism that I've experienced at work. There's so many things. And I also want to name like it sucks. It literally sucks so hard that a lot of times people who experience racism and are the ones who are aggressed have to be so strategic, have to spend hours
yeah.
figuring out how to confront the person or their boss to like support them in confronting the person. Like it is so much labor. And I say this to white folks who attend my workshops that are specific for white people. Like you literally have no idea how many hours we spend surviving you, trying to survive you and to accommodate you. So I just want to name like it's not fair. And a lot of the work that I do with folks is to be like, all right, what are the things that activate you the most? And so during my confronting racism at work workshop, I will say, like, I don't believe in sort of blanket strategies. We have to really root it in things that are specific to us. So, for
Mhm.
example, if one thing that I think is really important to learn how to do is move from a reactive position to a proactive one, in order to have full agency in how we are engaging with this experience of racism, like,
Yeah.
how do we do that? So, for me, my default is to just dive right into conflict and be angry. And sometimes that's useful, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes that's gotten me in a lot of trouble. And sometimes when I was advocating for someone else, it harmed the other person more.
Yeah.
And so, I learned the hard way and obviously had to do a lot of work to repair that relationship. And that is something that I do. Um, but sometimes if we can have control over how we respond, and sometimes we can't, sometimes literally we have trauma responses, but where we can, exercise the muscle
Mhm.
of stepping out, making a choice and being like, you know what, Yejin, if the outcome that you want is for them to do X, Y, or Z, actually my anger is going to get in the way of that. And once again, it sucks that I have to do that work. It sucks that people of color
Yeah.
have to do that work. And the way to be safe is to sort of acknowledge the reality. And so that's sort of some of the work I do. How do we like increase our attunement to ourselves, to our bodies? Because sometimes our boundaries also might change. One day it might be like, I actually feel pretty good with my anger. I
Yeah.
have like a good control of it and I feel like I can express it in X way. And another day I might just be so tired that I'm
Hmm.
like, yo, I just need to go on a really strong, aggressive walk, or I need to take the day off.
A power walk.
Yes.
So there is a tool that I'd like to share with you, and I'll send you a link after the show. But for the audience, there's a tool that I, as a conflict practitioner, use. It's called the Thomas Kilmann Conflict Mode Instrument, or the TKI. I'm not sure why, because well, anyway, I'm not here to talk about acronyms. But what this does is this helps people to understand what their dominant conflict styles are. So what you were describing, Yejin, actually is also my dominant conflict mode, and that is
Compete.
competition. That is, I am trying to win. Now, I found through taking this questionnaire that actually my secondary conflict mode is collaboration. So that's looking to find solutions with people. And when I'm really managing my own emotions and understanding what it is that I'm trying to accomplish or negotiate for, then that's often the mode that I'm able to employ. Now, this is not to say that the other modes of conflict are bad. The others being there's well, let's see. There's compromising, there's placating,
There's
and
avoid.
avoid. Right. Yeah. So none of these are bad. They're all useful in their own situations. But if we are reacting to your point before, if we are being reactive, that is to say, we are not choosing which modes of conflict to employ, then who knows what's going to happen? So I would say that if we are going into conflict situations, that absolutely the kind of preparation that Yejin is talking about is 100% necessary. Now, it's true that sometimes if you are somebody that can manage themselves well, who is also perhaps a conflict expert, you might be able to engage in these things on the fly. I will say that although I do have a great deal of experience, it's still hard for me to go in completely unprepared. So I say all of that. One, because if we are practicing humility, is knowing that just because we've gained some skill in some area, it doesn't prevent us from any of the pitfalls that we're trying to prevent. But also, we have to recognize this in other people, right? If you catch
Yeah.
somebody off guard, they're not going to be their best self. And it's not fair for us to expect them to be, or to hold them to this really high standard that we always expect. And this goes back to the thing I was saying about things being static. If we can't have dynamic understandings of the people that we're engaging with, then ultimately we're really not seeing their full humanity. And that is a disservice to them and to us and to the work.
Yeah, totally. There are a couple of things. Oh my gosh, I wish we could talk for like another 4 hours. But one, I actually was introduced to the conflict mode instruments during a workshop, and then I filled out the assessment, and it turned out I had 0 points in avoid. And then the facilitator like looked at my card and was like, Yejin, are you tired? And I was like, I'm so tired. I'm just like in every conflict. And so what was really useful was like, oh, you should be able to actively choose
Yeah.
when to utilize avoid. So like Yejin, maybe it actually makes sense for you to postpone a conversation for a week until you've like cooled off. Or
Yeah.
I was like, oh, that is very useful. So there's that bit that I wanted to say. I also, we've been focusing on like, what is all of the labor that people of color have to do in order to survive their own experiences? The other thing that I do is one, I do work with white folks, but I do specifically in an iteration that feels good to me as someone who
Yeah.
has had to accommodate whiteness for a really long time in my career and like lose pieces of myself as a result. And so I
Mm,
have this workshop, one that's actually coming up in December called Unfiltering the Fury. This is the third time I'm going to do it.
all
And it
right.
came about as like an emergency. So I had, people in my network who were like, my white managers are causing me so much harm and I don't know what to do anymore. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to come up with this thing. I didn't know that so many people would register. So this is, again, the third
Yeah.
time, which is wild. But I bring this up because I'm very clear in the event description. I'm not for everyone. This isn't for everyone. This is specifically for those folks who do acknowledge that they like are invested in white supremacy, just don't always always know how. This is for people who like want to actually experience the discomfort of my anger. This is for people who want to experience what decentering whiteness looks like. So like white people are my audience, but you are not being centered. People of
Right.
color are being centered. And so what
Yeah.
that means in translation is like, I don't give you permission to interact with me very much. I give you
Mm,
permission to share in the chats like how you have accidentally upheld white supremacy and caused harm to your POC employees. I give you permission to affirm one another. I give you permission to like form community with each other, but like forming these really strong limits is another part of the work. And I do it in part to like humble people. But I wanted to bring up, there was someone who offered me feedback through this feedback form that was like, sorry, I'm laughing because I feel like the bar is so low. I'm glad this person was honest, but I asked like, what were some of your takeaways? And one person said, I didn't realize that participating in a 3-hour workshop doesn't make me an expert. Because I explicitly said, I do not give you permission
you can't
to
be serious.
to teach your colleagues this material because like I don't trust you to translate this. And so I explicitly said like your attendance at a workshop does not make you an expert. And so I just wanted to share that with you because I'm like, thank you for sharing that. I'm really glad you learned it. And also like bar is so low.
Wow.
Um,
I'm not saying that the master's degree is the be all end all, but it does have mastery in the title, right? And I will note that it's not a master's workshop. I've never seen that. I would have taken several by now. But yeah, that's mind blowing. I do hope that you will share with us, the flyer for the event so that we can post that in the comments here and, plug the great work that you're doing.
oh yeah.
I mean, I'm seeing that we just have about 10 minutes left here. So I wonder if we can kind of pivot to resilience, right? So that's a word
Mm.
that gets thrown around a lot. We've been talking about all the labor and how tiring it is, but there might be somebody who's out there watching us talk right now and kind of wondering like, yeah, this does sound like a lot of work and I want to be proactive, but like how do I stay resilient? And I don't know. I mean, I'm curious what your thoughts are, but certainly what I've learned through this work more than anything is about myself. And that sounds weird and individualistic and perhaps even narcissistic, but coupling that learning with humility. Again, this is why humility is super important. It's learning about myself, not for myself, but so I can learn how to be in community with other people, right? Like you, Yejin, I used to get into conflicts all the time, and I'll share that when I learned about the TKI, the conflict mode instrument that I was talking about, it was in the context of my negotiation class first semester in grad school. I scored a 98 on the competition side, and we had to plot all of our points up, anonymously for the class to see. And a bunch of my friends saw it and was like, "That one's Rico," and it's like, nice. I'd
Red,
like to
you
think
were
I've come a
red.
long way. But yeah, so your thoughts on resilience, please.
Oh my gosh, thoughts on resilience, please. Well, I think that I I have avoided language around racial healing for a really long time, and I think that's in part because of my own relationship to like grief and wounds. But I think for a while I was like, oh, the focus should be on policies and procedures, how it's baked into institutions, without really considering the ways in which like humans are the ones who make choices to uphold existing systems, and humans are the ones. And so I have changed, I think, in the last 3 years, my orientation around that. And I bring that up because I now really deeply understand that this work is so freaking personal, right? Like my relationship to power and authority is very much about my childhood, is very much about my
Yeah.
upbringing. It's like so much to unlearn and it's deeply, deeply personal. And so I say that, it is really hard to do this work if we can't hold ourselves accountable to anything. And if like we can't do that because of pre-existing wounds, because, let's say for me, my desire to always be understood or my fear of being misunderstood somehow supersedes my commitment to being called in and being held
Yeah.
accountable, that's going to stop me from actually showing up in the way that I really want to. So I say that, I'm not a healer. I'm not a healer. But this work is very much about healing. And so I think part of this work is figuring out, like, what do you need to heal to show up in this work in a really embodied way? What are the things that are getting in the way? What are like they might feel like very cerebral or deeply feelings oriented, but like if, your shame spiraling is getting in the way of true
Yeah.
growth, then like you gotta address it. And I say that with love, like you gotta address it, because that is going to stop you every single time from being transformed. So I think that the work of resilience is like the work of healing. And I say that as someone who's like, I'm East Coast vibes. Like, I'm not gonna talk about healing all the time, but like, wow, it's like operationally getting in the way.
Yeah, yeah. No, 100%. So, to kinda capture what I'm hearing you say is that, yeah, this work is deeply personal, deeply individualistic, but we gotta be doing the work together. So, let's reach out and make those connections. That's not to say that we can depend on one another to do the work for us, but it does help a lot to be surrounded by other people who are also engaged in the work, who are also dealing with their own doubts, and frankly, seeing things that we can't individually see ourselves. And so, as somebody who's been on a journey like this, even though I'm doing a lot more emotional labor than could have thought possible, I do feel uplifted. I feel affirmed. I feel connected, and that's in the midst of a global pandemic. I will say that that took a lot of work and, a lot of risk taking, like I used to not love reaching out to random people to have conversations. And now that I do it all the time, I can't really imagine proceeding without continuing to do that. And on that note, I do also want to shout out to our mutual acquaintance and friend, uh, Katrina Kisumbing King, who connected both of us. And so thank you very much for that. I've really loved building up a relationship with you, Yejin. I love the work that you do, and I love the energy that we get in our conversations. And I'd also just like to invite our audience to connect with us on social media. And if you liked this chat that we've been having, please do like and share. Other things, I do want to also mention that coming up on November 5th, All Aces Inc. is having a free public dignity activity. So if you're interested in a simulation that helps people to understand what's at the heart of oppressive workplace dynamics and structural racism, then that's a great opportunity, and we'd love to see you there. So last question for you, Yejin, is ultimately, what would you love to see come out of your work?
I would love to see folks feel more comfortable with being transformed. Like whatever it takes to get there, whether it's, identifying what are the barriers to me embodying the things that I care about, or, what are the things that I need to unlearn or decolonize from in order to like really understand my power. However we get there with our different positionalities and identities, I just think that this invitation to like be transformed by community is really the work, I think.
Yeah, I love that. And on that note, thank you so much, everybody. So sorry about the technical difficulties earlier. It has been one of those days. I hope you all
Woo.
have a wonderful weekend. And if you got thoughts about your own transformation, please do reach out. Love to hear the stories. And have a wonderful weekend. Thanks.